Everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me my buddy, Dr. Jay Davidson, who is the founder of drjdavidson.com. Let's hope he's the founder of that, because if somebody else took that domain, that wouldn't be very good for him. And he focuses on functional natural medicine. He's a popular speaker and two-time #1 international best-selling author. And he was the host of the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit, the Parasite Summit, the Viral and Retroviral Summit, and the Mitochondrial Summit. He's also the co-founder of Microbe Formulas. And in this presentation, he's going to be talking all about how radioactive elements are robbing your energy. And I had a chance to look over this presentation beforehand, his slides, before we started recording right now, and I'm super excited about this. This is really novel content that I haven't heard anybody else talking about. So I'm really excited to introduce everyone to Dr. Jay Davidson.
Ari, it's awesome being here. So appreciate all the work you do and just the hours that you labor behind the scenes researching and putting things together that people probably don't understand and don't grasp the amount that you do, but so appreciate your work and how much you've touched the functional medicine and natural health and even regular medical community with your info. So it's really a pleasure to be on here.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate the kind words. And the feeling is very mutual. So I'm super excited to get into this. This is a super cool topic. So give me, let's take us through this. What is this all about? What are radioactive elements?
Yeah, so this has been brand new in the last probably 1.5 to 2 years of researching, and you said it's novel. Haven't heard many people speak or anybody speak on it, and I haven't either. So this has just been kind of going down the rabbit hole and going on to PubMed and going on the internet and researching and really trying to put the pieces together. But it all stemmed from my wife, which a lot of my journey has with her. She gave birth to my daughter when she was 30 years old and basically crashed. Lyme disease flared back up. We had heavy metal toxicity issues, which we knew about years before, but couldn't really figure out how to do it. And pretty much everything boiled to the surface. Her body shut down, stopped breastfeeding. A couple months, 2-month-old at home, and my wife, nearly dying. That shifted my path. And ever since then, I feel like she's been that guide that just keeps, like, what direction do we need to go? And I'm very into, I like looking at labs. I like looking at symptomatology, the whole examination type thing. But I also like to kind of get into, see if, there's a muscle tester, like what do they find is kind of just a tool in the toolbox. Biofeedback, the technology side, I've been very intrigued. There's been a lot of things I would say is definitely just crap out there. But there was one machine that I thought was really interesting, the Eductor machine. And the founder.
What's it called?
It's called the Eductor, Eductor. Another version, an earlier version, it's called the SCIO, SCIO. And I had a friend, basically my daughter was getting headaches and tummy aches when we lived in San Diego at the time and doing all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, you know what, let me just call my friend Trina. She's kind of out in the, energetic world. Let's see what she picks up. And she ran a scan on her and picked up basically cranial sacral. Like she really needs some cranial sacral appointments. And I was like, okay, my wife and I were trained chiros, we adjust, but we never went through the cranial sacral type training. So, as far as shifting sutures around and all that, just not super familiar with it. And started thinking about it. It's like, this symptom of headaches and stomach pains, tummy aches all started after we moved to San Diego. We just got a couch. She started jumping on it. She was only 4 years old at the time and flipped over the edge, head like face down into the floor, the wood floor or whatever. It was like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like literally it's like your heart stops as a parent. And then within the same week, she did it for a second time. And it was like, oh my gosh, no more jumping on the couch. This is crazy. And it all kind of stemmed back of like, I think that's actually what triggered it. Went through some cranial sacral, headaches, stomach aches, went away. And I'm like, wow. I guess maybe there's something to this energetic, kind of weird machine stuff. So looked into it, and the most advanced or the newest machine is the Eductor and whatnot. But anyway, so scanning my wife on that machine, just kind of being more open to it after that experience, radiation and fungus would come up in the top 3 to top 5 every scan. And it was like, radiation, like, we have no Bluetooth in the house. We have no Wi-Fi. Like, everything's hardwired. Obviously there's, lights and things. I mean, you can't be zero, but I feel like really minimized. We don't live next to a cell phone tower. And
I want to mention something real quick. I in general have been very, very skeptical of a lot of the bioenergetic sort of scanning machines. And one of the big reasons why is that they're totally non-repeatable. They seem to actually just be generating random data from what I can tell, because I've tested it and I've done a test where I've scanned myself on several machines, seen what it generates, and then done it again 10 minutes later, generates totally different data. Done it again the next day, totally different data. And so, and then I've even talked to the owners of some of the makers of this, and they're like, oh, well, the scan itself disrupts your bioenergetic field, and therefore, it will change. I'm like, that is total nonsense to make that claim. Like
yeah,
the most basic test of science is that the results have to be repeatable for it to have any validity. If it doesn't have that, then it's just random, useless junk data.
yeah, I would concur. I mean, I've been so interested in technology over the years. The Zyto, the Acyro, which is now the Quest 4, and all these different types of machines, because it's like, oh, this is so cool, but yet the reproducibility was always that thing. And they'd always say, well, it's because you're inputting energy. So, and I'm like, so I've never, I've always been open to learning about it, but same thing with you. And basically what we found with this biofeedback machine, and the owner, if you will, he was part of like the junior NASA program, and was like calculating one of the Apollos coming in for a landing in the ocean when they had all these giant wall computers. And he was like the young kid that figured out exactly where it was before anybody else did. Just one of those, just apparently off the wall brilliant, but maybe so brilliant that missing something, I don't know. But anyways, coming back to the machine, like radiation kept showing up, and I was thinking, just okay, EMFs, that's all I hear about, EMR, electromagnetic radiation. And then we came out with a new supplement, a mito product, basically mitochondria. And all of a sudden, the muscle testing from some different practitioners started picking up radiation. And I'm like, now it's actually matching up with biofeedback. What happened there? And started going down the route and asking questions and looking at it. And Todd Watts, my good friend, he's like, it's radium. Like, radium keeps showing up. It's like, what's this? Like, I don't know. So we started doing research and basically found that there's this thing called a radium belt that's in Wisconsin that basically stretches from Green Bay down to Milwaukee, almost into Illinois. My wife grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. She lived in Illinois for a little bit. Illinois has got really high radium, just like Wisconsin does. And it's like, and I just basically went headfirst into this topic. And coming out big picture was what I believe the next step is as far as getting people well. And it directly relates, which is really awesome. It directly relates back to the mitochondria. It seems like everything comes back to the mitochondria, the whole cell danger response, which obviously you've researched and talked about a ton. Mitochondria, and it's basically the dictator of hormones in your body too. I mean, it's like the rate limiting step for hormone production in your body, amongst like all kinds of other things. And its key role in the immune system. And I thought, well, how odd is this that there's such a prevalent area of Lyme disease in Wisconsin, the same area, or very, similar area where there's really high radium that suppresses the immune system. It's like, this seems to me in my head to make sense of suppress the immune system. You're more likely to get, infection or infections. But really, when you dive into the research, radioactive elements, essentially you can say radiation, but I kind of steer away because I think people start thinking about the EMF thing. Mm-hmm. You could say radioactive metals, but they're not all technically metals. So I kind of go with the radioactive element term, if you will. And this would be the cesium, uranium, thorium, radium, which I mentioned before. And I think that's really the key one to highlight, which there isn't any public testing really available for radium, which I find interesting, but the government tests, it's like, what's going on with that? And then you've got radon, if I didn't say that. And, there's all kinds of these radioactive elements anyways. And so when I started going
in the mountains, right?
It depends on the area. So like radon in Minnesota is in certain pockets is really prevalent, where then you basically do the radon detection test, which is air. And then if you have it, they put this, fan in your basement that basically helps us, pull the air out, and you're good to go. But the thing is radium breaks down into radon eventually. And the half-life, depending on the isotope, radium, there's 224, 226, and 228. The main ones to be concerned about is 226 and 228. But the 226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. So it's like, if that gets in your body, that's continually emitting energy that's damaging your DNA and damaging your mitochondria, and whatever area it's in is going to basically create inflammation and suppress the immune system. But eventually radium breaks down into radon. So if you're in an area where there's high radon, then we want to consider, oh, there's probably a lot of radium as well too. So I started going down this route, and just kind of high level synopsis: radioactive elements, they suppress your immune system, they cause inflammation, suppress healing. And I've seen just clients over the years, I don't work with clients currently anymore, but over the years, I had so many people where it was like, doc, I just don't feel like my body actually works. Like it's not even healing. And I'm trained chiro, like I think your brother was too, or is. And the whole premise when you go to school, it's like your body has this innate ability to heal itself. It's like, well, why can some people seem to like do great and then others, not so much? And I believe radioactive elements are a piece to the puzzle. It slows down drainage. It's a big cause of candida. I used to always think heavy metals and mercury and all this for candida, but I'm really pushing more into the radioactive elements. And then it damages mitochondria and actually changes your genetic expression. So those are some big things, just high level on the radioactive elements. But as I went through, researching, I'm like, well, maybe it's the, nuclear incidents, the 3 Mile Island, the Chernobyl, the Fukushima that we had in 2011, in Japan, and started looking at, measuring the air, if you will, supply of, where I used to live in Milwaukee area, then used to live in San Diego, more where you're at right now. And then now, I'm in Puerto Rico and they have a measurement for San Juan. I was like, okay, well, you can see the air amounts of radiation in the air are different, but it's like, is that really, really the factor? And I kept coming back to, I don't know, it seems very pocketed and not so much like obviously nuclear incidents and causing radiation across the globe is not good, but it seemed like there was something else. And I think what I figured out was it's more of our water supply. It's that these elements are naturally occurring in the earth. And when we start doing some drilling, fracking, or just regular wells, we basically bring out this stuff that's radioactive deep within the crust, or we do a deep well with just well water, if you will. And that water is going to contain more of these radioactive elements. So the more that we kind of dig deep in the earth, the more this stuff comes out. Because when they do fracking and they do regular wells, there's this thing called brine that comes out, which is basically unusable. And essentially what they do is they put it into storage, they put it in trucks, they haul it around. It's super radioactive, lots of radium in it. And then they go to either store it or they just shoot it back into the earth and, try to, the other stuff, they're keeping, the whatever gas and stuff, oil that they're pulling out from it. And it's like, wow, I think that's a factor too. So I really believe as I look at it now, the water supply is probably the big factor for radioactive elements.
As you're talking, I realize the one other time that I've had any talk of this conversation is a conversation with a guy who's the founder of Pure Effects water filtration technology, who I've interviewed on my podcast, and he brought up this topic of radioactive elements in the water supply. For example, in the Colorado River that feeds in the ground, the water for Southern California where I live. And I had never heard of that. And I remember actually looking into it. This is probably 2 or 3 years ago when I did this interview. I remember looking into it and going, oh, sure enough, he's right. There is actually research talking about radioactive elements in the water supply. And he specifically created filters around, that filter out radioactive elements. So connecting the dots here in my mind as you're talking.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's all I've been doing the last, year and a half, 2 years, and only seeing things make more sense. So I don't think it's the end all, but I do believe that I actually believe radioactive elements are more toxic than heavy metals, and heavy metals gets obviously a ton of attention. I'm not a fan of glyphosate either, but what's interesting, even research has shown that when plants get sprayed with glyphosate, it actually increases the amount of radioactive elements that are in the plants by up to 17 times. So it's like, wow, we're just throwing another, interesting thing on it. But backing up, you've got different forms of radiation. You've got the gamma radiation, which is, medical testing and, all that stuff, if you will. And that penetrates several layers of tissue, the X-ray, the CT scans, that kind of stuff. But I really want to focus on, as you look, there's basically 3 different types. There's alpha, beta, and gamma. Gamma is the real intense. Beta will penetrate your skin layer, at least the top layer. So if you're taking a shower and there's some beta emitting radioactive elements in the water, you're going to technically be able to absorb them through the skin. Now, what I believe is a big factor, though, is more the alpha. So the beta comes from more the man-made radioactive elements. So that's going to be the Fukushimas, if you will, where they have 1.2, million tons of water right now with over 60 plus different radioactive elements that they're like, we're not really sure what to do with it. We're running out of tanks. And the best option right now that they're getting approved for is to put it back into the ocean. I'm like, man, this is just so crazy what's going on right now. But in there, you've got things like iodine 131. So you hear iodine, you're like, oh, you need it for thyroid and breast tissue and skin. But there's radioactive isotopes of that are man-made from these nuclear reactors. There's cesium that comes from it as well too. So these are the betas. But when you look at the alphas they don't penetrate your skin. So if you were to take a shower and there's some uranium, there's some radium, if you will, radon, even though radon's a gas, it actually will get into the water supply too. So there's actually a small amount that gets in the water supply. So if you're taking a shower and you're like, well, even with these radioactive elements that are in the water, these alpha emitting radioactive elements, they actually don't penetrate the top layer of skin. But the thing is they can also be, if you ingest it, so any water you drink, and that's why it's so important to have some type of filtration when you're drinking water, but they can also be inhaled. And I'm thinking, how many people take hot showers and are these, chemicals vaporizing and also breathing in? And we assume that they're alpha emitting, that they don't penetrate the top layer of skin, but you hear people quote all the time, well, if chlorine in the water, you're going to be absorbing that, and it's, for every 10 minutes in a shower, and, you have no idea where they get these stats, but every 10 minutes, it's one glass of water worth of chlorine because you're absorbing it. It's like, okay. So what I like to think about, Ari, is keying in on it. I really believe it's radium, because you can run like heavy metal testing through doctor's data. For instance, the urine toxic metals been popularized over, years in the functional medicine side, and it's got heavy metals that it tests for, what comes out in your urine. But also in there is uranium and cesium, but there's no radium. And the government's done radium testing. The Environmental Working Group has done testing. The Environmental Working Group tested over 157 different public utilities, and they basically found that over half of America has radium that exceeds the level of basically putting you at risk of cancer. Wow. And so they said 170 million Americans. They did this study, I believe, from 2010 to 2015, surveying and testing all the water. So it's about 5 years old, obviously, when they released it. But they said that 80% of Texas has radium that's in a basically exceeding government levels in a toxic amount. 80% of the state of Texas, 170 million Americans total, which is basically like 50%. And I'm like, great. So where can we test this stuff? Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't know. And then when I looked in the research, really diving in, radium, some of it comes out in your kidneys, but it's easiest processed by your body to excrete it through your stools. I think it's gentler on your system. And according to this textbook where they actually had this, only place I saw it, 98% of all radium that came out of the body left through the feces. So I'm like, okay, so maybe we have to go, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I really believe that we need to get better testing to really fully understand this, because a lot of this I'm just theorizing and I'm pulling out of research, and it clearly makes sense. But again, this is very, very early on. But going back to the alpha emitting radiation, if you're standing by a campfire, great. You're a few feet away, depending on how big it is, it's going to feel good. But now imagine taking that ash and swallowing it. And as soon as you swallow that ash, now there's a whole level of damage that happens versus just like, oh, I'm feeling the heat. And I know it's an extreme example, but it's kind of to show that the alpha emitting radiation, which when we're looking again at the alpha emitting radiation, we're looking at, radium, radon, uranium, thorium as well, plutonium, polonium. So there's a bunch of different isotopes. But when you actually ingest it, drinking it in the water, or actually breathe it in, that's when it's getting into your system, and your body has a really hard time clearing it out. And that's when it's going to be continually emitting this energy that's breaking bonds. So that's what it means by ionizing radiation, alpha, beta, gamma, is that it's strong enough to basically damage your bonds. The radiation that a lot of people in the health space right now are talking about is non-ionizing radiation, the cell phone towers, and there's a lot of seems like there's a good amount of research, but it still seems like enough too to kind of question what's its effect and, all this. But I think the radioactive elements is more of a slam dunk. This is bad. This is damaging mitochondria. This is suppressing the immune system, which of course, if it damages mitochondria, is going to have that effect on the cell danger response. But
yeah. So where do we go from here, understanding that these things are likely there? Is it fair to say that we're all being exposed to this to some degree, or is it just specifically in certain geographical areas?
It's a great question. So, based on the fact that they found, half of America, 27 states where it exceeds limits, it was all over. And you can look at the map. Environmental Working Group has an interactive map, and you can see and click on it. And I went there, I clicked on it, and I started researching the radium belt, and you can see where basically radium is really high in this whole, they call it the belt from Green Bay to Milwaukee, like I mentioned. And I clicked on where we used to live. We used to live in Waukesha, kind of looks like Waukesha, Wisconsin. It's like a suburb of Milwaukee. And I clicked on it.
Dab in the center of the radium belt.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it was 10.5 or 10.8 picocuries per liter. And essentially the government set a limit of 5 as kind of, anything under 5 is fine. And that was, more than double, 10 plus. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, I think back when my wife crashed from giving birth to my daughter and Lyme disease flared up. That's exactly where we lived at. I'm like, that's gotta be a piece to this whole puzzle. So I still believe, mold plays a role, other toxins like heavy metals and glyphosate, emotional stress. Parasitic infections and other types of chronic infections, bacteria and virus. But I don't know. I just keep coming back to this. Seems like it is a big one. I don't know of any testing, which we're right now in our lab. We're actually, we've invested quite a bit in equipment. We want to try to figure out if we can test this, actually have people send it in, because I don't know anybody else that, has it available. If somebody knows, just love to hear that.
Yeah.
But essentially,
I'm looking at the map right here, and almost the whole East Coast, especially Florida and the Northeast, as well as a lot of the Midwestern states and Southern states, Texas, and then unfortunately Southern California and, San Diego, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, those particular areas look like they've gotten hit pretty hard. Salt Lake City, Phoenix. But yeah, it's interesting to look at this map. And for people watching the video, we're hopefully displaying the slide here and people can see this. But yeah, it seems to be all over. I would say, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho,
basically Utah, where people Nevada. Don't live.
Yeah. Those areas look like they've got it the least.
But you also wonder, did they do a lot of testing too? Did they really focus more with more populated areas, right? So the thing to key in on, I don't want people to be in fear. This is just, again, becoming aware. And as we become aware, then there becomes more options, right? Like you look at what's available for food today versus 15 years ago. There's so many more natural options. More things are transparent because we've become aware. So that's what really I want to come from this. But radium is probably that one thing that I would key in on. Uranium, we think about it because it's used to power nuclear reactors. But radium has 3 million times more energy than uranium. So radium's a big thing. And again, when you have something that's got a half-life of 1,600 years and it gets inside your body, I'm sorry, and half-life just means that if you have a milliliter or a milligram, if you will, of some toxin like radium, that it's going to take 1,600 years for the isotope 226 to basically break down, emit energy, and get rid of in your body to excrete half of that, 1 milligram or 1 liter, depending on what type of it is. So thinking about that, it's like, okay, this stuff's around for a while. And the thing about radium is you can't smell it, you can't taste it in the water, and it is a bone seeker. It loves to compete for calcium and go into the bone, and when it goes in the bone, it's starting to mess up immune system, bone marrow, all that stuff. And lead has been really, viewed as, well, that's the osteoporosis thing, right? Lead competes for calcium, but radium does too. And radium actually is more damaging than lead. So I don't want to discount lead, but really I want to give more attention to radium, just with all the testing that's really occurred. So
Yeah. I want to mention something and then ask a question. For people listening, Jay's mentioned a couple times lead in the water. People would, I think, be shocked to learn that there are actually recognized unsafe levels of lead, which is, we have way more science on that. It's been around way longer than radioactive elements. We know this is extremely toxic. For example, affects development of fetuses in the womb, and numerous health problems are associated with lead poisoning, and or just chronic intake of small amounts of lead that's at unsafe levels. And yet a large portion of populated areas have unsafe levels of lead in the water. Plus, aside from what's standardized, and sort of the city filtration areas, there's also an issue of lead piping, old lead plumbing in people's homes that's leaching lead into the water from the time it goes from the city, filtration areas and sanitation areas to people's homes. It's actually acquiring more lead. And so I think many people think, the city's taking care of it. They're monitoring it. They've got all the, they know what's safe and unsafe. They're sanitizing the water of all these unsafe chemicals. And I think people would be shocked to learn that there's already an issue of unsafe amounts of many known harmful substances. And I think radioactive elements are just adding to that list.
Yeah, bingo. I mean, look at this summit, right? It's a superhuman energy summit. Why am I talking about radioactive elements? Because it's damaging the mitochondria, the cell energy generators that we were taught in biology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, I can't get up over this hump. I just can't get any sustained energy. Well, what if the water you're drinking every single day is actually contributing to that? Unless you're Dr. Boris Laszlo and don't really drink water, and just use, then you don't have that issue. But most people, right? I'm like, that's really interesting. You really don't drink water. But, for the vast majority of people, what we understand is you should drink water because our body is mostly made out of it. But if the water you're drinking has these chemicals in it, it's like, clearly we need to shut the source off. And I go back and forth, talking with scientists, and it's like people that are actually trained, they're not just listening to summits and stuff and like what the hot topics are. And I'm like, what is the best water? Because I really believe that there's the chemistry of water, which is the whole filtration side, but there definitely seems like there's also the physics of water, the whole fourth phase of water, and, all this work that's been done on, if you will, structure of water. I'm like, okay, I think they're both relevant, but as far as the chemistry of water, what is the best filtration? Because I used to own ionizers, and, you hear about, well, don't drink RO water or distilled because it's basically like dead water, and you want high pH and all this. And right now, where I'm at right now, I really believe that we've had the rug pulled out from under us on this whole pH thing. That I think back over the years when I used to have when we have our chiropractic office in Wisconsin, and I remember this guy coming in to do live blood cell analysis. I'm like, this is really cool. And I'm like, well, what do you recommend? He's like, oh, I just recommend that you follow, a plant diet because it's just high alkaline foods. I'm like, okay. What else? He's like, oh no, that's all you do. You just eat high alkaline. And I'm like, you don't even look healthy though. Like, I don't really want to, follow what you're doing. But yet you see so much of like, oh, you need 7.365 is really where your blood pH should be. But when you look at the chemistry of pH, it's a man-made scale, 0 to 14, man just created it, if you will. It stands for potential hydrogen, but it's measured in millivolts. The lower the pH, meaning like 1 pH, which we would say is super acidic, that's like the sulfuric acid and all that, that's actually got the most energy. But the higher the pH, the less energy. And I'm like, I almost feel like we're going the wrong direction. And in the water side, how do you get a high pH? You just add some minerals to the water. It's like, okay, well, are we even supposed to have minerals in the water? So I've been really processing this whole water thing. Right now, I've got a Berkey at home, but I'm flustered at that company too, because I've learned like they just private label stuff. They actually don't create it. But the research that they did for the Berkey, they looked at radioactive elements, and I was like, great, they're filtering 99% or whatever, but it was the first 50 gallons. I'm like, well, what happens after gallon 100, gallon 1,000? I'm like, man, we
and for people listening, in case that's not easy to follow, it's what happens after the filters get saturated and they start to lose their efficacy in filtering out those elements that they at the beginning filter out 99 or 99.9% of.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. There's just so much to this topic. It's like and I don't have clear answers as much as I really believe radioactive elements are a big piece. I would say number one step is filter your water. Mm-hmm. Distilled water, RO water. I have a Berkey right now. I'm still on the fence of what the best thing is. And it seems like every practitioner I talk to, they have some different water filter that they like. I'm like, I'm just up in the air. So I don't know if you have a favorite on that or looked into it.
I get Palomar spring water delivered, which is, I've seen their third-party data on, contaminants, and it's extremely pure. And I get that spring water delivered. I have a 60-gallon drum in my garage. They charge me a $1 per gallon.
Wow.
And I get that thing filled up probably every 3 weeks. And so we have, very pure, high altitude spring water delivered to my house. I've also, like you, gone through many different varieties of filters, and I have, I've gone through RO, I've gone through the gravity filters, the Berkeys and the Aquaceras and things like that. And then the Pure Effects are probably my favorite they are my favorite of the filter options, which is not RO. It's called a multimedia filter. It just runs it through just different chambers of things, but it's not technically a reverse osmosis process, so it doesn't strip it of minerals. But yeah, I mean, there's still, as you said, this issue of, okay, we know how those filters work at the beginning, but how well do they work 6 months into it?
Yeah.
And we don't really have great data on that. And I certainly hope that they still work pretty well, but we don't really know.
Yeah, because I remember when I bought the Berkey, they're like, oh yeah, the black filters on the top, they last 5 to 7 years. It's like, well,
yeah,
what are they testing for 5 or 7 years? And maybe they do. I don't want to be throwing arrows or anything, but it's more of like, well, let's test to 100 gallons the radioactive elements. Let's test to 1,000 gallons. Like, where does it drop off and where does it drop off at, right? Like, it'd just be great to have some data. So I think really a big takeaway from all this and the whole topic of radioactive elements is understand radioactive elements. I think you're going to be hearing more and more of it. Obviously, I'm, really in the forefront of trying to educate and challenge the status quo, if you will, see if we can get some testing and things. But filter your water. I think that's a big thing. Limit or either get stuff like you get that, hey, there's no radium, there's no, uranium, cesium, iodine, right? The deeper in the earth you go, the more that you're going to get these radioactive elements. But then you also have to be aware there are the beta emitters that are from man-made. When Fukushima happened, they found iodine 131 over in Vermont coming out of the milk of the cows. It's like, okay, well, that's going to happen in those type of events. But generally speaking, the deeper into the earth you go, the more you're going to pick up these radioactive elements. So it is, it sounds good for what you got.
I have one question before you get to the other practical strategies. You mentioned that at least some of the radon, was it radon? Not radon, radium, gets excreted through the feces. I'm curious if you found any data on, what percentage of the radium that's ingested actually gets absorbed into the body versus gets excreted. And like, is it possible that it just sort of mostly passes through, or does it seem to all get absorbed and then pass through the body for a while and then only a small percentage gets excreted? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the only place that I found, it was a textbook of research, and I could find the reference for it, but it was basically that when they gave radium and what came out, 2% came out through the kidneys and the rest through the feces, or 98%. But it didn't actually specify how much was staying in the body versus,
right.
So their percent could have been 100% of it could have been flushed out, which I have a hard time believing that, but that's always possible.
If some pass through the kidneys at all, then that suggests that at least some of it is getting absorbed into the body.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at it to see like, and I get, and I understand if people don't, you know, aren't open to muscle testing or biofeedback. Like, I don't think anything's an end all. I just always look at it as they're all tools, you know, it's kind of just inputting data and does it make sense. And as I inputted that data, it all lined up and made so much sense. I mean, I look at, oh man, there's just so much to it. So, in the end, yeah, filtering your water is super important. I'm a big fan of iodine, and in the um, iodine to iodide, the salt form of iodine ratio, the Lugol's ratio. We've got one with
You
some.
recommend Lugol's?
I don't, because the liquid, I mean, we have our own, so clearly I'm going to be biased toward that. But the Lugol's, if you ingest a liquid, it basically gets tore up by the stomach acid. So if you're going to do something like that, then you're just going to probably just put it topically, you know, on and absorb through the skin. We've got one that we were able to get compressed into a tablet, so it doesn't get basically ripped apart by the stomach acid. It's 12.5 milligrams of the iodine ratio with some bioactive carbons that are more for binding on to halogens. Because the issue that I have seen is that you've got bromine, chlorine, fluoride, these other chemicals, and fluorine, you know, fluoride and chlorine are in the water supply. Bromine, you buy a brand new electronic and it's got brominated flame retardants on it, or the, you know, furniture, if you will. So we're exposed to all these different halogens. And in our food supply, it's all this stuff too, brominated vegetable oil, and, you know, even finding Gatorade, and obviously it's not good to drink anyways. But anyways, we're surrounded by these other halogens that essentially compete for iodine, kick it off, and then they're there. So when people take iodine and they react, I really believe some of it's because there's no open receptors, that these other halogens are occupying the receptors of where iodine should be. So the bioactive carbons we add in extracts of fulvic acid are for specifically helping to bind onto the halogens to then kind of empty that out. So a lot of the quote unquote Hashimoto thyroid storms and things we just don't see, you know, adding that element. So
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, one of my good friends, Dr. Alan Christensen, actually his next book is very centered around iodine and thyroid health. And one of the things, I mean, I'll communicate his perspective. I definitely don't claim to be an expert on this particular topic, but basically his perspective is there is a very, very narrow range of optimal for iodine intake, much narrower than most other substances. And yes, it's possible to be deficient, but it's also possible to have too much of it, and that definitely contributes to increased risk of Hashimoto's. So you alluded to it there, but just to kind of frame that, what do you think of that, and how would you respond?
it's interesting. You know, I'd love to read his, you know, book or information that he puts out when it's out there. I, you know, life's been a lot different in the last 3 or 4 years since I've been hanging around some scientists that have really had different perspectives than what's been out there in the mainstream media. For instance, like minerals, there's plant derived minerals or organic minerals, which essentially are bound to a carbon molecule, or there's inorganic minerals. And in the mineral topic, you know, somebody says, "Oh, I'm copper toxic." It's like, well, as I look at it, I really believe that somebody could be copper toxic and copper deficient at the same time, meaning that there's different valences of these copper minerals, if you will, and certain ones are not beneficial for the body. For instance, you mentioned lead pipes. Well, houses have copper pipes. So is that copper in a pipe actually the copper that the body needs, or are we actually needing more of an organic copper that's a plant derived, right? That's been basically brought up through the earth, processed by the plant, and now it's more, you know, utilized by the body. And obviously you can take other minerals as an instance. And I honestly think that in a copper toxicity type state, this is just my personal feeling, is that a lot of those people, they're toxic of the inorganic form, but they're actually deficient of the inorganic, or they're deficient of the plant derived form, because we find out, oh, according to this test, I'm toxic, so I'm going to completely stay away from it. But what if the answer is actually consuming plant derived minerals, which I don't believe you can actually become toxic of those, because their body can process them. So if there's excess, like, or if there's too much, like the body just clears them out. But you can become toxic of inorganic minerals where they build up in the body. And I actually believe the plant derived can help to, I don't want to use the word chelate, but can help actually remove the inorganic to help swap out and replace.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wonder that with iodine as well in the form, because there's been iodine experts over the years, like Dr. Brownstein, which is, he'll get to a lot higher dosing than other people, like Isabella Wentz, I think, is a lot lower dosing iodine type, and have all these people in between. But he says, well, you can never become toxic, if I remember reading his stuff properly, from years ago. You can never really become toxic of it because your body just cleared out. It's like, okay, well, that definitely is different than Dr. Alan Christensen, but then this is also brand new too. So it'd be interesting to really look at that.
Yeah, my intuitive feeling on it is to consume iodine like in the form of foods, in the form of seaweed, for example, rather than like if you were going to supplement with it, rather than to use something like Lugol's. But which seems to be aligned with what you're saying. But I'm curious, do you have any specific thoughts on how you're recommending people to consume iodine?
Yeah, well, again, I don't believe we get enough in our diet unless somebody's like a big sushi, nori, seaweed person, and I don't know actually many people that are that eat a lot of that food. So I'm a big component of supplementing iodine. Obviously, I'm going to be biased toward ours, but ours is a plant derived iodide with the bioactive carbons in there to help with the halogen. And I look at iodine though as a long-term thing. So if somebody believes, hey, we're deficient because it's not in the soil and my body needs it, like every cell of the body needs iodine. So if somebody says, well, I'm allergic to iodine, it's like, you can't be, because otherwise you wouldn't be alive. Like your body needs it. Every cell does.
Mm-hmm.
It's known for the thyroid. It's known for breast tissue. It's known for skin, but it's really needed, throughout the body. But I look at iodine, it's a long-term thing. Like, you don't have to megadose for a week and think that you're going to catch up. Like, it's just get it in, lower amounts is good. Just continually get it. And that's more of a long-term nutrient. I'm not a big fan of a lot of supplements forever, because then I feel like you're just not getting to the source. You're just, kind of doing the pharmaceutical thing, but with supplements.
Mm-hmm.
But iodine would be one of those more nutrients where I'm like, long-term, I think that is an important thing.
Got it. So filter the water, take iodine, or consume foods rich in iodine. What do you have any other thoughts on practical strategies to combat radioactive elements?
Yeah, I would say detox at the mitochondrial level. And this all started from the mito product that we came out with, that all of a sudden it stirred, what I believe is it stirred these radioactive elements out of the mitochondria. And now all of a sudden, when had people start muscle testing and it had it come up as a priority when it never did before, I think it brought a whole new thing that confirmed then the biofeedback, right? You're kind of getting multiple things. So really looking at the mitochondrial level, and there's a lot of talk about, well, heal at the cellular level and detox at the cellular level, but the mitochondria are inside of the cell, and red blood cells don't have mitochondria, but on average, anywhere between, generally speaking, hundreds to maybe 10,000 mitochondria per cell. But there's actually parts of the brain, Ari, areas in the substantia nigra. This was published in Neuron in 2017, I believe. 2 million mitochondria per cell.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, wow. So we have up to 2 million mitochondria per cell in some of the brain tissue. Regular brain tissue, more like 10,000. That we need to really key in on these mitochondria.
It's interesting to think of that statistic in light of Parkinson's disease, which specifically affects the substantia nigra of the brain. And if that's we would expect, since mitochondria are kind of these environmental sensors that are picking up on and are sensitive to stresses and threats and toxins in the body, we would logically kind of expect the areas that are densest in mitochondria to maybe be affected first or affected the most. And I'm sure you know this, but there's quite a lot of research on mitochondrial dysfunction being linked with Parkinson's disease.
Yes. Yeah. I just really believe that as we look at natural health, or the way the body's supposed to function, everything should come back to the mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
But then so everything to support it. So detoxing chemicals out at the mitochondrial level, boom, that makes a ton of sense. Now the question is, well, what is that? Because you have some of the world that doesn't even believe detox is necessary because you were born with a liver and 2 kidneys, which I kind of think is silly. And then you have, other
It's
people that it's
amazing
like,
that masquerades as the scientific position.
but yeah. So it is what it is. It's like, well, there's 85,000 chemicals registered in the United States.
Yeah. But you've got a liver and kidneys, so it doesn't matter how many thousands of more chemicals your body is bombarded with. There's no need for anything that supports detoxification processes. We should just keep adding more thousands of chemicals and expect our liver and kidneys to do what they do.
Yeah, and all supplements that claim detox is a scam, right? It's like, right. There's a lot of stuff that's not great, but clearly this has helped. There's this whole industry has helped a ton of people. But look at glyphosate. Glyphosate, as soon as you consume it, it shuts down biosecretion. It shuts down the whole P450 enzyme. In phase 1, it also shuts down actually biosecretion and bile excretion of the liver, which is what processes the chemicals, dumps it in the liver, clears it out. It's like, okay, so one toxin actually slows or shuts that process down. Mm-hmm. What are these other things? What are these other things doing? So I'm a big fan of, detoxing at the mitochondrial level, really looking at that. And we're looking at a bunch of stuff in the lab on how to help accelerate that. The one thing that triggered this whole thing was the Mito product, the Mito Restore. That we've got, but
which is mostly fulvic acid, right? Or molecules derived from fulvic acid.
Yeah. They're basically extracts of fulvic acid, and then our scientists, if you will add and change, things to it, if you will. But very low pH, which is very different too. Like we have this product called biomolecular oxygen, which has a pH about 1.5. And most people will be like, oh my gosh. But actually, when you think about it, if you consume something with a high pH and it gets into the stomach, like your stomach is really low pH, and it should be. So there's going to be, some competition with it. But the pH thing is we can probably put that on the side for another discussion, or I can, put you in contact with some, like Jeff or whatever on our team, scientists that can talk more about it if you ever want to. But the last recommendation I would say is TUDCA, TUDCA. So it's an acronym, all in capitalized letters. Technically, it's supposed to be TUDCA. Some people say TUDCA. You can go back and forth on how you want to pronounce it. I like to say TUDCA, but TUDCA stands for tauroursodeoxycholic acid, and it's something the body naturally makes. It's in about 2% of our bile naturally. If you look at like bear bile or bull bile, that can be 40 to 50% of the concentration with it. So TUDCA's been used for supposedly 2,000-3,000 years in Chinese medicine, because they would take like bear bile. So when sometimes people look at TUDCA, they're like, I'm not going to take that because it comes from an animal, or, it's like endangering bears. I'm sure there's probably stuff that comes still from there, but that's really where it comes back in history, if you will, to be a long-term thing. But TUDCA has been shown to protect the mitochondria. It's a water-soluble bile acid. So if somebody's missing a gallbladder, just taking a capsule with a meal can just help people digest meals, especially that are fatty. But in general, it actually helps to increase the bile production, the bile salt concentration. So you actually get better quality and more. It actually helps more bile to come out in the feces, because bile gets recycled. It's really expensive energy-wise to make, so it keeps getting, circulated basically at the distal part of the small intestine, gets absorbed, gets sent back to gets sent back to liver, and on it goes. Well, then, fat soluble toxins can come along with it. So the more you're actually excreting bile, I think actually can be very helpful. But TUDCA is really good for mitochondria. It's been actually awesome research for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even Huntington's disease. There's been research, and I can send you this. This was another rabbit hole I went down. I'm like, I cannot believe how much research there is on this. Cardiovascular, diabetes, helping thyroid. I'm probably missing stuff. I mean, there's so much. So if there's like one product that I love, because I'm a really big fan of the liver, really supporting the liver. It's like the detox lifeline of the body, but so much happens in that liver. The one product I'd recommend is TUDCA, or TUDCA, TUDCA.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. My friend, Jay, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the summit and delivering this really novel content. Thank you for putting the pieces together on this topic, and spending so much time digging into this really novel, fascinating stuff, and explaining it in such a clear way that makes sense. So this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on to the summit. If somebody's interested in learning more about what you do, or getting some of the supplements you mentioned, do you want to mention where they can learn more about that?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's been a pleasure to be on, Ari. Like I said, I just appreciate what you're doing and all the time you're putting in, because it is. It's like you go down a rabbit hole. You're like, what just happened today? I just read like how many articles and but it's all good. It's for the better of humanity and figuring all this out. But yeah, I've got my main website is just drjdavidson.com. We've got a retail line of our supplement products, microbeformulas.com, and then we also have a practitioner line where we do practitioner trainings and things like that. So if you're a practitioner, you can check that out. It's cellcorebiosciences.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, my friend. Really a pleasure chatting with you as always.
Thanks.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next